Hi, this is Brian Ellison, your professor in POLS 575, Public Personnel Administration, part of the Master of Public Administration program at the University of Idaho. This is a lecture on Frederick Mosier's book, Democracy and the Public Service. What a fantastic book this is, and we'll talk about that just a little bit. But first, a note on my PowerPoint presentations, which I do attach to the BB Learn site. These PowerPoint presentations are thrown together, and I use them simply to push the conversation in the classroom. They are informative, I think, but they're not by any stretch of the imagination good PowerPoint presentations, state-of-the-art PowerPoint presentations. I actually don't do PowerPoint presentations. I'm just doing this to serve students and hopefully make a few people happy. But I just don't have it in me to be some kind of a fantastic PowerPoint presenter guy. So use them for informational purposes. Don't put them together. Don't put together a PowerPoint like I put together a PowerPoint. Do something different, okay? I mean, probably the first professor who's ever said that. So beginning in the middle of the last PowerPoint presentation, after our talk about the difference between public and private organization, are some slides on Mosher, Democracy and the Public Service. And what I did was I pulled out some pieces of this book that I think are particularly interesting, though I think the whole book is fantastic. This book, written by Frederick Mosier, who is originally in 1968 is a classic, is the classic text in public personnel administration and public administration programs across the country. And it's really, in many ways, it's very antique and it's very quaint. He revises the book in the early 1980s, I believe, 1982, and he throws in a bunch of things about Watergate because Watergate was a big deal from a public personnel administration point of view, but really just does a fantastic job of sort of summarizing where we are in public personnel administration at that point. So he's got several premises, four main premises to his book. And his premises, let me just say his fundamental problem, his fundamental question is, how do we reconcile democracy, democratic practice with how we built an administrative state in the United States? How do we bring together the needs, desires, the wants of people who go out and elect representatives and what administrators do in public organizations? Isn't there a great distance between these two entities? And the answer is yes, there are. And there's some really interesting design questions associated with that. So he wants to address that. He's got four premises to this book. The first is that governmental decisions and behavior have tremendous influence upon the nature and development of our society, our economy, and our policy. It seems sort of trite once again, but you can't overstate this, right? When you look out your window, when you look at your community, when you look at your downtowns, when you drive on a highway, everything we've done in our society, everything we've used to organize it, the structural components, the legal institutions, all of these things are decisions. They're decisions people have made. Why does your downtown look the way it looks? Because of a series of decisions over years and decades potentially of that people have made together about what they should do, what kind of infrastructure they should build, what their buildings should look like, etc., etc. We make society, we construct society, and the foundation for that construction of society is in public administration. The people who lay the foundation for economic development are called public administrators, mostly working through local governments. So that can't be overstated. So it's critically important. The second is the great bulk of decisions and actions taken by government are determined or heavily influenced by administrative officials, most of whom are appointed, not elected. Yes. Who should build the bridge over the river? I think we leave it to the civil engineers. Who should design a food program for our schools? Nutritionists, right? We delegate all kinds of authority to public employees, and we delegate that authority to public employees because we have faith in their expertise. And so the development of American public administration is very much about, and that is who works in public organizations, is about the construction of the professions, the way we train people, the way we accredit people, the way we credential people. That's a feature of American administrative statecraft because we shore up our faith in delegation, in public delegation, by holding people accountable to professional norms and standards in our country. That's something we'll talk about a little bit more, but of course that's true. The third is the kinds of decisions and actions these officials take depend on their capabilities, their orientation, and their values. Yes. Um, Once again, sort of trite, but critically important, right? Who gets a job with the EPA? Do people who are opposed to, say, you go into the EPA, you're sitting down for a job interview, and you're quick to explain that you're absolutely opposed to environmental regulation, that environmental regulation doesn't work, that there's all kinds of other systems we could be using, that the EPA should be disbanded, and you got a degree in basket weaving. Are you going to get a job? The answer is no. Of course you're not going to get a job, because people who join these organizations, people who want to work for an agency that regulates for environmental protection, have faith and belief in that activity, right? And they go to universities and they study things that will help them get a job in that and help them regulate for environmental protection, right? They study environmental engineering, environmental science, some aspect of what it's going to take, environmental law, environmental economics, to help move the system along, right? And those people who don't get the jobs in the EPA, who sit in universities and study those same curriculums, get jobs in state departments of environmental quality or public health departments. They look the same, they study things the same, they look at the world the same. This is true. So, and what they're doing there, right, because they believe in things like environmental regulation, they're projecting their values to that organization. That's true. That's also good. And that can be problematic in some contexts, and we can talk about that. In fact, it's something we talk about daily today in the era of Trump. So the fourth is these attributes. Fourth is these attributes depend heavily upon their backgrounds, their training and education, and their current associations. Sort of a redundant point to the previous point, which was about their values. But yes, these attributes depend heavily upon their associations. I'm an environmental engineer. All the people I work with are environmental engineers. We all went to the same university. I mean, of course, we look at the world the same. The point there is we're distant from the voter, right? And we have some distance from them. And we could talk about that in a different context. If I was good enough to prepare a lecture on picket fence federalism, we can illuminate that just a little bit differently. So what are the fundamental issues? What I really like about the book is he gets right back down into basic ideas of public administration. First is the politics administration dichotomy, right? The idea of Woodrow Wilson that we're going to construct an administrative state. We're going to engage in administrative statecraft. This is from POLS 550 last semester. I lose the number. But the foundation is that there's a distinction between the political and the administrative. Woodrow Wilson writes in 1887 that we should draw a distinction between these, and we shouldn't let the political seep into the administrative or the administrative seep into the political, that we should keep these two things separate. And we engage in the process of building organizations and public organizations around this what's called the politics administration dichotomy. Now, we don't actually believe that anymore. We know that administration is highly political and vice versa. We still have created lots of organizations that serve our society around this sort of idea. The second is responsibility. How are we going to hold public employees accountable or make them responsible for their behaviors in public organizations? And the answer to that is, in American public administration, we delegate authority to public employees, and we held them accountable through their professional norms and standards. So in other words, or another way of thinking about this is, if I was going to teach a course on regulation, where I would begin, the first regulatory activity in this country really was groups going to state governments and asking for the public power to control access to their professions. The doctors going to the state government saying, we want to control and say who gets to be a doctor. The lawyers going to the state and saying, we want to say who gets to be a lawyer. The accountants going to the state and saying, we want to have a say in who gets to be an accountant. The development of the professions, the credentialing, which is a delegation of public authority, right? So we delegate authority to an engineer in an organization, and that engineer is beholden to professional norms and standards, right? They go to universities, they become credentialed, and there are ways of doing things. Medical doctors are held accountable by professional norms and standards. That is the fundamental aspect of the American administrative system. That's the development of professions is uniquely us. Not that there weren't professions in other countries and in other ways of thinking, but this fundamental credentialing is uniquely American. Representation and representativeness. How do we achieve representation and representativeness through public organizations? Do we hire 50% women, 50% men, 12% African Americans? How are we going to understand, the democratic experiment by looking at the administrative workforce writ large? And then the last one is mobility. So one of the main mechanisms of upward mobility has been public employment in this country. And the fundamental way of doing that has been to open up the universities. So after World War II with the GI Bill and a variety of different other incentives, we let all kinds of different people into universities. Poor people, rich people, women, African Americans, all kinds of people. And that changed the tenor of the universities, of course. In the 1960s, they kind of exploded. But the idea there was also to democratize the public service, right? To credential people who are different than white guys going into public organizations. Sort of fascinating, I think. Why should we develop employees? This is comes out of this human relations school, and you should read these books so that they'll make better decisions, so they'll have better morale, so that they can become self-actualized in public organizations, which is really kind of fascinating when compared to the, kind of the idea of scientific management. So there's a book that was written in 1911 by Frederick Winslow Taylor. I talked about it a little bit in my introductory lecture called the Science of Human Engineering, in which he says that we can literally manage the movements of people. And he looks at people loading pig iron, right? And if we make their movements more efficient, they'll load more pig iron. I'm using my hands here. Taylor would say this is an inefficiency. And this idea of Taylorism brings the concept of efficiency into American public administration. The fundamental value that we have is one of efficiency. It doesn't have to be efficiency. It can be something else. Other countries don't use the concept of efficiency. France might use the concept of culture, the protection of culture, as the number one value that should be promoted through their administrative state. But we use efficiency, and that gives us a variety of different things. Rationality, that we should use our brains. Planning, that we should think for the future. Specialization, that we should break things down in their component parts. Administration comes from differentiation in that context. That we should quantify things, quantitative management. That there's one best way of doing things. And that's always the struggle in American public administration. What is the fundamental way, and in particular, the fundamental way that is non-political, that is objective and analytical, the right thing to do? That's what the administrative state should be doing. And then once we find that one way, we standardize it, and that becomes the way of doing business, which is, continues to drive our thinking about public organizations today, but leaves little room for things like humanism, right? The idea that we could self-aggrandize in organizations, right? I'm doing something I truly love. I love the University of Idaho. I love serving students. This is my identity. It matters so much to me. It goes well beyond just coming at 8 and leaving at 5, which few of us academic types of people do, as we know. Is that good for the organization? The fact that I have so much freedom and I can do what I want to do. Those are great questions, and those are questions that get left out of sort of scientific management. Commitment to the organization matters, etc., and in developing people. Then Moser goes on to talk about, which I really think is fascinating, and I have to go really quick here to get through this, and you can read some of the slides, and of course you're going to read the book, but I really like his discussion about American higher education. Obviously we're in universities, but it is the case that the American university developed with the American administrative state. The American university developed to serve the American administrative state, that many of the professions and ideas and occupations that came out of the vocationalist orientation of American higher ed were created specifically for people to go into public service, public health, right? Public school teaching, you name it, public administration, city management, city planning. All of these things are about enhancing the public service, all the way down to the diplomatic corps and the foreign service, right? He talks about different trends in public administration. I really would like to, be able to sit here for hours and talk with you about those. But the Morrill Act, 1862, Abraham Lincoln creates the land-grant university system specifically to train engineers, agricultural specialists to serve the Civil War effort. I thought the Civil War was going to last a generation, and so he believed in investing in higher education. And we adopted the German focus on science and research for the dissemination of knowledge free of political, ideological, and religious bias. We're just going to produce knowledge for knowledge's sake, which becomes part of the universities at the turn of the last century. Then which coincided with the development of the public high school, which the idea of universal public education, which was the founders' idea, isn't realized till the turn of the last century, right? And the public high school is developed to serve the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, lots of vocational schools and professional schools and all kinds of other ideas, apprenticeship ideas, etc., move into the university. And universities become the place where we go to get training, to get a job. And then we infuse the liberal arts into the university. I'd like to have a long conversation on that too. But the idea there, liberal arts, is about politics. Jefferson would call it an art and the education of liberal society. You can't have an open and free society unless you have people who are broadly educated, broadly trained, who know a lot about lots of stuff, right? Sort of the generalist tradition in that. And that coincided with the development of the administrative state in some fairly fantastic ways. Let's see what else I really am interested in here. So one of the things Mosier gets kind of caught up in is this idea of the professions and the public service, the professions in government, their strategies of the professions. And so what he notes, and there's this little quaint point in the book where he says that we all know that the professions are really important at the managerial and upper administrative or mid-administrative levels of an organization, but the bottom line is we also know that people at the top of the organization tend to be generalists. People at the top of the organization tend to have much broader perspective than the myopia that's produced through professional education, which is sort of interesting because now we all know that administrative level is the key level. It's the level where the money is made, where the ideas are produced, et cetera, et cetera. So what he warns about us with regard to the professions, in particular, he's worried that professionals take over different spheres of our society, right? And they're not held accountable to the people. So the professions, he has 4 main points there, and then I have to let us go because my thing won't let me do more than 20 minutes. So number 1, the given profession has staked its territory with an appropriate government agency or agencies, usually with boundaries approximately coterminous with those of the organization itself. Yes. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but obviously if we're going to create an agency like the Bureau of Reclamation that's going to do water resources management, we're going to hire a lot of civil engineers, right? And those civil engineers tend to take over and define the agency. So within its organization, the profession has formed an elite corps with substantial control over the operations of the agency. Once again, Bureau of Reclamation. You have to be a civil engineer to get into the Bureau of Reclamation if you want to have a shot to moving to the top. And it is all organized around the concept of engineering and construction. I wrote my dissertation about this I wrote my dissertation about the Denver Water Department. Not very sexy, but incredibly, incredibly interesting how a dominant profession comes to capture an organization and what that dominant profession does with the organization. His third point is that to the extent possible, it has assumed control over employment policies and individual personal actions for its own members in the agency. Yes, those professions decide that only their professions get access to the organization. That's absolutely true. And that makes sense in highly technical organizations, right? If we have NASA and our job is to put a man on the moon, we're going to maintain strict control over the kinds of people that get let into that organization, just like any private sector organization, right? And number 4, it has provided its members with the opportunities, assurances, and protections of a career system of employment. Yes. So what we can say there is we develop professions because we think they protect the public interest, but then those professions take over the organization, and they manage the organization in interest of the professions themselves, perhaps not in the public interest. That's debatable, and that's something we've studied, something I've done a lot of study on, and have a lot to say about. If you see my bureaucratic politics lecture from the previous course, and maybe I should plug that in here, it's where I talk about this thing. But that is the idea of American public administration, right? That instead of staffing our organizations with partisans, we staff our organizations with experts. Those experts are held accountable to professional norms and standards. Democratic accountability is protected because they're not political, they're neutral, and civil engineers act like civil engineers, and doctors act like doctors, right? And we can find ways to talk about perversions and corruptions in those systems, but that's for another time. And then finally, he wants to talk about administrative morality in the final part of his book, which I think is really fantastic. The danger is that developments in the public service may be subtly, gradually, but profoundly moving the weight toward the partial, the corporate, professional perspective and away from that of the general interest. That is the threat. Of course, that's a threat. One of the really interesting books you might read on this is by Brian J. Cook. It's on Brian J. Cook, and it's on politics in the Environmental Protection Agency. And it really does an incredibly interesting. He writes an incredibly interesting book in which he looks at the sort of the battle between different professional perspectives in environmental protection. You have lawyers who think that we should protect the environment by suing people. We have scientists who think we should protect the environment through regulation and technical abatement through technology, right? We have economists who think we should protect the environment through economic systems. And they're all in the organization, the Environmental Protection Agency, and they have these wars about perspective. That's an example of an organization that has lots of different professions in it and is a weaker organization than an organization that has specific sort of professionals, professionally trained people. And perhaps the most interesting, of course, is the military, right? So those are public employees trained to provide public service that have, absolute control, pretty much absolute control over a huge segment of our economy and that behemoth that we would call the United States military, for good and for bad, I think. So once again, read the book. It's a fantastic book. I hope you truly enjoy it. Watch this little lecture. And I'll see you next week when we're reading the book by Enrico Moretti called The New Geography of Jobs. And have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.